Let's look at an utterly specialised mid-17th century German rapier. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, and I'm at Olympia Auctions. Now, I've been looking at a lot of the amazing things in the upcoming sale on 26th of June, link below to the catalogue. And this is one of the things that really caught my eye when I first looked at the catalogue. It is a mid-17th century, so it dates to about 1640, German rapier. And the reason there's actually quite a lot of rapiers in this sale, but the reason I particularly picked this one out is because it's got an incredibly specialised blade, which we're going to look at in a second. Now, before I get on to that, how do we know this is German? Well, there's two really good surefire ways to know that this is German. First of all, it's a typically German hilt. This particular pommel shape, coupled with this sort of Pappenheimer-esque guard, is an absolutely classic 17th century German style of rapier. Not to say that they were only worn or carried or used in Germany. We know from portraits, in fact, that these found their ways to England and France, obviously Belgium, neighbouring countries with Germany and elsewhere. So absolutely this could have been worn by and carried by and potentially even used by people anywhere in Europe, but it is a German style. The other reason we know it's German is because it has some writing on the blade. Right down here on the ricasso it says "Me fecit Solingen." So there's pretty much a giveaway there. It's pretty much as good as saying made in Germany. So it was made in Solingen, and obviously for regular viewers of the channel you hear me talk about Solingen quite a lot because Solingen was and remains to this day one of the most famous, possibly the most famous blade making centre, sword and knife making centre in Europe, possibly hand in hand with Toledo in Spain. And you could argue for knives, Sheffield in England. And obviously there are other blade making centres, but Solingen, what they really excelled at was mass production. Now they're most famous for mass production in the 18th and 19th centuries when they could outproduce blades for militaries, and they made military swords in such huge volumes, and in fact even swords for tribal societies, for example in the Sudan in Africa, they made swords in such huge volumes that they were able to undercut everybody else. So a little bit like Ford or Colt, they were able to essentially factory produce them and outproduce everyone else. However, if we come back to the 17th century, Solingen was already starting to be quite famous for making blades, but hadn't yet quite reached that height. So it was still more at the workshop level. And what we see here is pretty much an apex of 17th century rapier making. Now, let's get onto this blade that I have spoken about. Why is it so unusual? So, often I've spoken about the fact that rapier is a very loose and generic term, and in many ways you could say rapier doesn't describe a specific sword. It describes a large family of swords with a lot of variation. Some so-called rapiers have quite choppy blades, in fact, some quite broad blades, and some rapiers have incredibly narrow thrust-centric blades. This is, in one sense, very close to one end of the spectrum. It is a square section blade, okay? So if we just come closer to the camera there, the base of the blade here is the ricasso, if you want to call it that, although it's kind of a weird, the real ricasso is inside the hilt here, is square, rectangular to be more precise. Theoretically, it is actually a hexagon because it does have a little ridge along each face here. So it is in literal terms a hexagon, but in reality that ridge is so slight that the overall shape really is more like a rectangle. So this is a bar, okay? It's got no edges, it's got no cutting capacity whatsoever. And then we have this really attractive transition. Let's see if we can get, there we go. You see that transition? So it goes from hexagon that's almost a rectangle at the base here. It switches to completely square, and it's not even a flattened diamond section, a completely square section, but twisted by 45 degrees. So whereas this has got the flats here, this has the flats here and here. So it twists by 45 degrees and then continues on. And it is a completely square bar, all the way down to almost the tip. We'll talk about the tip in a second. So there is literally no cutting capacity whatever with this. You could whack someone with this bar, but it would be no different to whacking them with a heavy fencing foil or a car antenna, the old type. They don't have those anymore. So it's literally a square bar. It is utterly thrust-centric. Or is it? No, surprisingly. You'd think with something with no cutting capacity here would only be a thrusting weapon, but that's when we get to the tip, and the tip's really, really important on this sword. So if I come closer to the camera and let's try and get it to focus on the tip. So the tip of this sword is like a spearhead. It is a leaf-shaped and flared. So what they've done is they've taken this square bar and they have forged it out to provide two little cutting edges each side here, shaped almost like a teardrop or the end of a leaf. And what this gives is two edges. Now they're not very long, they're only about an inch and a half. So you think, why would they do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Based on my knowledge of rapier treatises and texts of the time and talking to other people. And at this point, I want to give a shout out to Henry Yallop, the Keeper of Edged Weapons at the Royal Armouries, who I've talked with a bit about this type of rapier, and he has a particular interest in these. Now, what's interesting about this type of tip is having edges, you would think that's for cutting. Well, is it? Well, bear in mind that edges on something like an arrowhead or a spearhead isn't necessarily for cutting in terms of chopping. It can be simply to assist the penetration of the point. Okay? So this technically could just be to make it a more effective thrusting implement. However, when we're fencing, we often find that it's possible to do certain types of cut, which go by various terms in different languages. But these are essentially tip cut. Now, these aren't the type of cut that are going to remove someone's arm or chop into their body, but they are the type of cut that can cut across the face, across the neck, across the hands, the forearm, or the thighs where the arteries are, much like the neck as well, incidentally. So these are harrying, wounding cuts that are done in rapier fencing. So, in other words, this at first sight seems like an utterly specialised thrusting rapier, but with a tip that gives you the ability to deliver certain type of cuts to unarmoured and uncovered targets, which might change the course of the fight and might assist in penetration through certain types of clothing as well, particularly layers of clothing. So there we go, an incredibly interesting rapier made in Solingen, because it says so on the blade, of a particular family of German rapiers, and an absolutely scorching, gorgeous example in wonderful condition, and it feels like an absolute dream in the hand, and that is lot 160 in the upcoming sale at Olympia Auctions. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.